Hi there, this is Grumpy Opinions. Let's get on with the show. WandaVision is the MCU show which didn't actually used to have titles for each of its episodes, but now suddenly they all do, because they've just gone in and added them all round about episode 4, so go figure. Episode 4, We Interrupt This Programme, starts off with Geraldine reforming from dust, Endgame style, in the middle of a hospital, not aware that any time has actually passed. I'm really confused because her mother isn't in the hospital bed. And after running around a whole load of unblipping people, she bumps into a doctor she knows, who tells her her mother actually died 3 years ago, 2 years after she disappeared. Oh, and we also learn that her name is actually Monica Rambeau. And it turns out that Monica is actually an operative for S.W.O.R.D, the government agency we've been hearing a lot about on this show. And like a lot of the blipped people, she's been just gone for 5 years, and as a result, now that she's suddenly back, she's been placed on restricted duty just to make sure she's okay with everything. And that's an operational procedure put in place by her late big boss lady mother, Maria Rambeau, who you might remember from Captain Marvel. So her new G-Man boss type sends her off on an easy mission, to meet an FBI agent, Jimmy Woo, who's at the town of Westview, looking for missing persons. And according to the local cops, the town of Westview doesn't actually exist, and they can't see it and they've never even heard of it, and they say they came from Eastview, even though they're literally standing right outside the sign for the town. And Monica ends up sending in a test drone which just vanishes, so she walks up and sees that there's a barely visible force field, and just sticks her hand right into it and vanishes, which makes sense. And after that it's all hands on deck, obviously, and the sarcastic lassie from Thor and some other scientists have all been drafted in to figure out what's going on. And after being vaguely obnoxious, she works out that there's actually signals coming out of the place that can be picked up on old cathode ray tube TVs. Meanwhile, Jimmy and the boss G-Man decide to send a guy in a hazmat suit in through the sewers, and they notice that there's this colour TV signal which they all end up watching, commenting on, examining, and they end up noticing stuff like Monica being part of the show. And as we go back through the old episodes, we see things like the colourised, weird-looking helicopter, and then that they try to communicate with the radio. But the show edits out all the strange, interesting moments, and similarly, the hazmat suit guy transforms into a beekeeper when he passes through the barrier. And finally, when they get to the finale of episode 3, the show cuts from Wanda getting really cross with Geraldine, till suddenly the ending, and the S.W.O.R.D folk just can't figure it out. But then the show lets us see what really happened, and how Wanda actually used her magic to literally throw Monica right through the world and out of Westview, who's realised that it's Wanda that's causing everything. And when Vision comes back into the room, Wanda has a moment of the illusion being broken and she sees what he really looks like, dead. Then she reasserts control and tells him,
"This is our home."
And he just looks concerned. So what did I think? Well, I've got a lot of thoughts about this week's episode, so strap in, grab a cup of tea and let's get going. First of all, I think this episode is really one for Marvel fans who up until now have been kind of scratching their head about this, or tapping their fingers as they wait and try and work out how this show makes sense within the established MCU franchise of big action, Joss Whedon-esque jokes and adventure. And so this is the okay, here's how this fits in episode, and interestingly, most of the characters here are existing side characters like Jimmy, who was in Ant-Man and the Wasp, and Darcy, who was in Thor 1 and 2, and Monica, she was actually the little girl in Captain Marvel, the daughter of Maria, who we did at least get a photo of, just in case you hadn't actually worked out who she was. And totally, I've got to be honest, until I saw that photo, I didn't even remember who she was. I'd completely forgotten everything that happened in Captain Marvel, because I just wasn't that fussed with it. I thought it was a mediocre movie. But I also liked a few of the small touches in this episode, like for example, the title is We Interrupt This Programme. It's not program as in you would see a TV program, it's as in you would see a computer program, that spelling. Or how they flagged up everything that was a significant point, like is this Skrulls, why hexagons, which I pointed out last week, and also showed that things like the beekeeper was really just a guy in a hazmat suit, which I said last week. But how everything sort of reinterprets it by the sitcom magic. So similarly, a bit like, the helicopter that came in, why it changed from being a drone into being a toy helicopter. But it's also interesting that Wanda's now directly being labelled as the cause of it.
It's all Wanda.
Which, I have to say, is a bit of a stretch for Monica to just say that's the case. Sure, there might be more that we're going to find out next week of things that she found during her investigations. But otherwise, if it's literally that she turned around and Wanda went magic and zapped her out, that seems like a bit of a stretch considering Wanda's always had magic, and if she's under mind control and doesn't understand, then it seems like a normal reaction for her. So I'm surprised the show dropped that in as an indisputable fact. It felt like it was, here's something that we need the audience to know for certain. regardless if it makes sense. And to move into slightly more negative territory, I mean, that is slightly a problem. I mean, it reminds me an awful lot of films like Event Horizon, where it's suddenly out of nowhere someone turns around and says, we've decided that the ship has been to hell, and we're not going to explain how we worked that out, but there you go. Now we can just continue with the film with that as a bit of factual knowledge, even though it makes absolutely no sense, and it's the weirdest guess that a scientist would ever make about a spaceship that had vanished. But yeah, anyway, I feel like in a smarter, cleverer show, they would have teased a lot of this out more slowly and a bit more piecemeal. Now, I might again be comparing this too much to things like Legion, which I've mentioned a few times, but also shows like Westworld, where there's a lot of complex storytelling and world building being done, and little nuggets of information being dropped left and right with the odd red herring. Whereas this is a light comedy, sitcom based show in the MCU, which, I mean, let's be honest, the MCU has never been much deeper than a garden puddle, and even at its absolute best. I mean, honestly, the most complicated it ever got in 20 movies is probably the scene where they tried to explain time travel in Endgame, and even that was really just a joke of how all the different characters just kept referencing different movies that have time travel in them.
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit?
Now, sure, we're not expected to know everything. We don't know how any of this begun, if it literally is just Wanda or what set her off into this situation, how she ended up in this town, who else is involved, if anybody, and also what is the whole thing about the hexagons and the bees? I mean, is that important? Because if it isn't, why on earth is the show drawing so much attention to it? But also, what's also really unclear is, last time we saw Wanda, she was at Tony's funeral. Like, that was in Endgame. That was after the unblipping or whatever it was called. And it's not been made fully clear how much time has actually passed between the blip and the show. I mean, I'd expect that if it's enough time for Monica to be fully back to work after her mother's death and being unblipped, then it's a couple of months, if not 6 months to a year, at least. And that got me thinking, because one thing that really bugged me this episode was the character of Darcy reappearing in the MCU. Now, that's no shade against Kat Dennings, who plays the character. I think she's actually a really good actress. But I never liked the character of Darcy. I mean, I always felt she was this smarmy, sarcastic, Daria-esque student that always kind of rubbed me up the wrong way, because the whole point of her was that she was this character who kind of just says what the audience is thinking and makes, like, popular culture references and things. And she was always a bit obnoxious. And the thing was, that's fine, because she was supposed to be about a 22-year-old student or something at the time. But this is meant to be 15 years later. I mean, the first Thor movie was 10 years ago. And there's supposed to have been this 5-year gap where after everybody got blipped. And yet she's not only dressed exactly the same, she's acting exactly the same. I mean, even if she hadn't been blipped, it's been 10 years of stuff that's happened in there. I mean, the character has managed to go from being a political science student to being an astrophysicist with a PhD. Now, that's fine. I don't begrudge that. There's been an awful lot of time in the show for that to be the case. But then at the same time, she acts exactly the same. I mean, do you know anybody that 10 years ago is exactly the same as they are now? Especially after somebody who has experienced aliens arriving and giant Norse gods turning out to be real and being involved in all that, and then half the population of the Earth being destroyed in an instantaneous, finger snap and crumbling to dust, and then coming back again 5 years later. I'm going to be honest and say, I don't believe anybody's going to act exactly the same after that amount of time with all those things happening. I just don't buy it. It seems like bollocks. And similarly, I mean, I get it. It's a telly show. It's not uncommon for them to do that kind of thing. In fact, I can hardly complain considering, Atonement is a film I really like, and Atonement has the same character being played in 3 completely different points of her life with exactly the same haircut, purely because the film wants you to know that it's the same character, and it's telling you it's the same character by having her have the same haircut. Now, sure, this is the same thing. I mean, again, do we actually know anybody who's had exactly the same haircut their entire life who wasn't completely bald or something? No. Now, I get why it's happening. Again, it's basic stuff. They want to have the character back in because, it's a familiar character, and it might rub me the wrong way that we haven't seen her in a decade and apparently she hasn't changed. But, yeah, I mean, I think the real issue is that it's not that I'm worried about that, I'm worried about actually, maybe this is realistic, and actually there's an entire generation of Americans that are stuck in a state of complete arrested development and are exactly the same in their mid to late 30s as they were when they were in their early 20s, which is a scary thought. And forgetting Darcy, and Monica, okay, I actually quite like the idea that the wee kid from Marvel grew up and then, oh good, and then she decided to be some kind of space exploring secret agent. I mean, that's fine, that works for me. What doesn't work for me is she's supposed to be this top-level operative, and her first thought when she sees a weird alien force field is to stick her hand into it. Now, what if it hadn't sucked her in, and it had just been the sort of thing like in a movie where somebody puts their hand up to it, like the one in Endgame, and it just burns and destroys whatever you put up against it? Now, that would be a bit silly. And other than that, this episode kind of dragged a wee bit, and a lot of that was because most of it was just dropping in info bombs and exposition, and a lot of that was just Darcy making daft comments and pointing things out, and it kind of did feel like a, just in case you're bored, let's get everyone up to date and let's give you all the information you need to be following this at this point. Also, there's the weird way the show dropped in this director guy. Now, I'm not entirely up on like comics and stuff like that, but I'm completely going to be amazed if this guy lives to see the end of the series. Or if he does survive, if he doesn't turn out to be like a secret Hydra agent or a Skrull or something. And that's partly because, and this might sound bad, but post-Captain Marvel in the MCU, the franchise really doesn't seem to like putting men in boss positions over female characters. They just doesn't. I mean, the exception to that being Nick Fury, but he's kind of a weird special case. And to be honest, he's not really anyone's boss. He's just kind of this spy guy who kind of is in charge but doesn't really actually have much bossing over people. So for suddenly them to drop in this head of S.W.O.R.D, who apparently took Monica's mum's job, even though, she did die, and even though he's a little bit self-deprecating, I mean, look at this guy. This guy's got "I'm going to die before the end of the season" written all over him, or he's got "I'm going to turn out to be a bad dude." Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. But anyway, genuinely, I'm just curious to see where this show is going to go. I mean, we've got two storylines now, one inside the sitcom, one out, and we've got Vision clearly breaking his programming a little bit and becoming self-aware, and Wanda's going off the rails, so interesting stuff. I genuinely can't wait to see where this is going to go. So till next time, you've been watching my Grumpy Opinions. And a special thanks to everybody listening, and especially my patrons, and most especially to Michelle Forbes and Judith Coloma, my top tier patrons. Thank you everybody. Everybody stay safe. Cheerio.